Hello. Today we are looking at the first lesson in our Paper 2 Cold War unit, where we are examining the first unit, um, which is to look at the reasons why the Grand Alliance broke down. So we're looking at the causes of the Cold War. Today's lesson is what role did ideology play in the Grand Alliance? Our statement of inquiry for our first unit on why the Grand Alliance broke down is common ideologies and interests can help to form relationships, or if absent, cause them to break apart. So this unit is all about how political ideologies can really help states and countries kind of form relationships and eventually alliances. However, if states don't have kind of ideology in common, if they don't have similar economic or political systems, then there remains tensions between those states that can actually push those states apart. And we see this with the beginnings of the Cold War. We're going to look at how the superpowers after World War II, the USA and USSR, we're going to look at how their kind of rival ideologies really drove them apart. And some historians argue that it was at its heart, the Cold War was an ideological conflict, and rival ideology led to the Cold War. Whether that's true or not, we're going to explore in this unit. But today's all about exploring exactly what were the ideologies of both superpowers and how that actually caused a lot of underlying tensions in their relationship. So, as this is the first lesson in the Cold War unit, we need to kind of discuss what the Cold War was. So, the Cold War, it kind of comes straight after the Second World War. Now, during the Second World War, the Grand Alliance was a term coined by Winston Churchill to describe how the allies in the war, that's the USA, UK, USSR, and others, to describe their alliance. Winston Churchill called it a Grand Alliance. It was an informal name for the grouping, but that's what we mean by the term Grand Alliance. And they were fighting against the Axis powers in World War II, Germany, Italy, and Japan, but also some other countries. The problem was that's a rather strange alliance, and perhaps it should be called the Strange Alliance, not the Grand Alliance. The reason for that is, well, America, the UK, the USSR, they were completely different countries in 1945 and had been for many years. Ever since the Russian Revolution of 1917, they had been kind of political, economic, and ideological rivals. The USSR was a communist state. It was dedicated to the principles of Marxism Leninism, whereas Western nations in Europe and North America were what we call capitalist states, and to varying degrees, they had a form of democracy. America and the UK were what we call liberal democracies. They believed in the importance of individual rights for people and human rights. So why did these allies come together? Well, it was the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany and the threat he posed to the international order, the post-World War I order, kind of forced these rivals into what we call a marriage of convenience. However, when Adolf Hitler's Germany had been defeated in 1945, the kind of reasons for that Grand Alliance disappeared very quickly. And we see these ideological tensions bubbling to the surface again, culminating in the Cold War, which would last until 1991. So the term Cold War, to describe a conflict as a Cold War, essentially means a period of extreme tension between two or more states, stopping just short of war. So we don't actually see any direct fighting between the two powers in question. There might be kind of what we might call proxy wars by their allies, but there would be no fighting. And we often see this term used to describe the relationship between the US and China today. The famous British writer George Orwell, he kind of almost predicted the Cold War in the few years before it. He actually interpreted the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan in 1945 as bringing a kind of peace that is no peace to the world. With the threat of nuclear weapons from 1945, there would always be this kind of lingering sense of destruction, I guess, in global politics, and the world had fundamentally changed. So we often remember the Cold War as a period of kind of nuclear tension, the kind of ongoing threat of an imminent apocalypse, kind of adding tension to war politics. It was also a space race as well, and both allies kind of scrambled to develop more advanced weapon systems, leading to missile technology, and eventually the kind of sending of satellites into space and the first manned space missions in the 1960s. So historians do debate, well, what type of conflict was this? We know it's a Cold War, but what were they arguing about? Now, some would say, well, it was like any other conflicts. They were arguing over kind of politics, who should control resources and power in the world. So that is one way of looking at the Cold War. However, others would argue, no, this was quantitatively and qualitatively different. This was an ideological struggle. It wasn't just about power. It was about kind of the ideas that shape human history and the kind of future of humanity. So there's different ways of looking at the Cold War. A brief timeline here. You will be doing a timeline task shortly, but you can see some of the main events of the Cold War there. Some of them may be jumping out of you. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 possibly being one of the most severe crises of the Cold War, when it seemed possible that nuclear war could happen at any minute. So we begin our unit in 1945 at the end of World War II, going all the way up to 1991. So we're going to be exploring some of these events. So that was the Cold War. So what was the role of ideology in causing it? Well, if you think that it was a war about ideology, then you could say the beginning of the Cold War goes as far back as 1917. With the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks taking power in Russia, Russia became the world's first communist state, posing a threat to capitalist states. However, if you think the Cold War was more about the self-interest kind of power politics that we see in history, then perhaps the end of World War II is a more appropriate start date for the Cold War. That is when, with the defeat of Germany and Japan, there was a power vacuum in Europe and Asia. Both superpowers raced to fill it, and they came into conflict as they did. So you can see that your perspective on the war kind of dictates when you think it begins. But regardless of how important you think ideology was, it clearly had a role in kind of shaping how both sides looked at each other. It kind of fashioned their hopes and fears and how they perceived each other. And at the very least, you could argue that ideology set up the potential for future conflict. Didn't make it inevitable, perhaps but it did set up the potential for conflict. So that leads us to the question of, well, what were their ideologies? And to start with, what motivated Western kind of states? Well, most Western states, it's not a very precise term when you say Western, but it does kind of describe the states of Europe, the North America, and other kind of Western influenced states as being capitalist economic systems married with kind of democratic political systems. And in UK and the US, a liberal democratic political system. Remember, you can have different types of democracy. Some countries have a more authoritarian type of democracy where people have elections, but they don't have as many rights. Liberal democracies, people have lots of individual rights and the rule of law. So we'll skip through a lot of human history, but by the early 20th century, the 1900s, modern capitalism was the kind of most popular economic model in the world globally. Okay. Say popular, it was the most predominant, the most powerful. And the core belief of capitalism is that it is profit that should drive economic decision making, not need. So regardless of whether people need certain goods, access to food, shelter, and other human needs, it's profit that should drive that, not kind of morality. So individuals in a capitalist system should be free to make a profit. That seems kind of selfish, but capitalists like Adam Smith, who kind of developed many of the theories of capitalism, he would argue that actually it's selfishness and greed that actually can lead to some public good. If you are making a profit with your business, then you're going to be employing people, and that money trickles down to workers and everyone benefits. And if workers have money, they're spending money on goods and services and shops, and therefore money is spread across a state. So it is the drive to make a profit that leads to kind of progress, that leads to development. Capitalist countries generally kind of don't like state involvement in the economy, and capitalists would argue that governments shouldn't interfere in the economy. They shouldn't put laws in place that prevent trade. Okay, so businesses should be able to operate how they want. I'll give you an example of why. Well, some governments, to make money, they can raise taxes on trade to make money. That makes a government really rich, and a government can then spend the money on the people. But that actually slows down business. If businesses have to pay tax, that's less profit, that's less wages. In today's world, most capitalist economies do have some form of state intervention. For instance, there might be laws in place to kind of protect workers. So that's capitalism. Politically, most Western states had some form of democracy, as we've said previously. Liberal democracies kind of have a focus on the rights of individuals. They have universal suffrage or elections, and they try to limit the power of their governments. Okay. So it's the focus on individual rights, like the right to property, that kind of helps business as well and helps grow a free economy. So we often see in Western liberal democracies a capitalist economy and vice versa. And these states can also be kind of marked by a focus on human rights. Religious and political freedom is encouraged. But I guess one of the criticisms of countries like the US would be that this focus on individual rights comes at the cost of the rights of society or other groups, and can encourage inequalities. If you put no laws on wealth development, then the rich tend to get richer and the poor tend to get poorer. Okay, so there are some downsides there, which leads nicely into the ideology of the USSR. As you probably know, the USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was one of the world's first socialist states. That was after the Russian Revolution of 1917. And they renamed Russia the USSR in 1922. So what is a socialist state? Well, a socialist state subscribes to the ideology we now know as communism, and that was first developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848. They published a pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. And that drew on a long history of kind of radical politics and kind of left-wing principles, what we might call socialist principles, to argue that many problems in the world of inequality, of poverty, of conflict, it can be traced back to the problems of the economic system, and that capitalism was the cause of kind of class conflict in the world. And if we're going to create a better world, we need to change that. We need radical social change. Marx argued that in future, a communist society would be one in which there would be no classes, no middle class, upper class, working class. It would kind of be like a utopia in which everyone gives according to their ability to those according to their need. And it would be society, not individual business owners, but society that owns the factories, the means of production. And by doing so, they would remove inequality, money would no longer be needed, and the government would eventually wither away. This was kind of the vision of communists, and it's quite inspiring to many poor workers across the world, this kind of utopian style politics. There's a bit more detail to explore there. Marx's original work was concerned mostly with describing the problems of capitalism. And Marx argued it was the middle classes were the ones that owned all the wealth. Therefore, if you looked at politics, if you looked at culture and society, it reflected the interests of the people who owned all the wealth, and that was the middle classes. So in order to change society, the working class would have to overthrow the middle classes and set up what he called a dictatorship of the proletariat being the working class. And therefore they could ensure the equal distribution of goods and to end the inequalities of capitalism. But Marx didn't really talk much about whether that would be a democratic state. Would a communist state be democratic? Well, it was kind of touch and go, and it was an experiment. In the world's first communist country, its leader, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, he developed the principle of democratic centralism. And under Lenin in the 1920s, the USSR turned into a very authoritarian dictatorship, where Lenin ruled the Communist Party as a dictator and the Communist Party ruled the state. There was no democracy as we know it in the West. And this kind of ideology, this fusion of Marxist ideas with kind of this authoritarian Leninism in practice, became known as Marxism-Leninism. It's not an exciting name, pretty much says what it is. And that became what would be the dominant form of communism during the Cold War, Marxism-Leninism. So why was it so authoritarian? Well, Lenin argued, as we saw in Russia, that yes, it's one thing to have a revolution and get rid of a government, but the enemies of the revolution, the ruling and middle classes, they would return and kind of take back power from the working class unless you could scare the middle classes and upper classes with the use of terror and violence. Terror and violence would be necessary to prevent the return of the bourgeoisie. Okay. And we see this in the Russian Civil War that preceded the Russian Revolution. The West and many middle classes in Russia tried to take back power. So Russia became the world's first communist state, but it was a very paranoid state to begin with because it did have enemies at home and abroad. And Lenin argued, well, unless we turn other countries communist, then we will never be safe because the capitalist countries would always want to kind of get rid of us. Lenin went even further. He argued that Western democracy was a lie, was a sham. He said that Western democratic systems, there is democracy, you can vote for who you want, but it's the middle classes and ruling classes that still have power. Political parties were mostly middle class parties. The focus on individual rights allowed elites and business elites to persist. That wasn't really democracy if it was shaped and controlled by those who had wealth and power. And Lenin would argue that Soviet Russia was even more democratic than the West because although they don't have free elections, they removed the inequalities that drove people apart. If everyone is equal, then why would you need to vote for other parties? That's what he would argue. In 1917, Lenin published a pamphlet called Imperialism, the Highest Form of Capitalism. And he argued that all of the European empires and Western nations that had empires were, again, another reason why the world was facing so many problems. He argued that imperialism essentially was the last form of capitalism. Okay, and this was a really inspiring document to many kind of nationalist movements and working class movements in Asia and Africa and the rest of the world. Lenin argued that only world revolution would get rid of European colonialism, would get rid of the inequalities in the world, and secure a more equal world. So to do that, you've got to get rid of someone, you've got to have a revolution. So that kind of suggests that a conflict at some point is inevitable if we want to make the world more equal. So how did these ideological differences manifest themselves? Well, you could look at the foreign policies of both Soviet Russia and the USA to see how the kind of ideology drove conflict. And if we look as far back as 1917, as we just described, Lenin argued that capitalism had grown into a world system of colonial oppression. It's this drive for profit that led countries to kind of occupy other nations. So they had to get rid of it. And to do that, the USSR created an organization called the Communist International, or the Comintern, in 1919. And they funded that with state funding, and the Comintern sponsored communist parties across the world. It trained underground communists. It provided political training and military training and funding. One of the most famous examples being in the 1920s, the funding of the Kuomintang in China and Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary movement there. In response, Woodrow Wilson of the US saw the dangers posed ideologically by communism. He published an alternative vision for the world in his so-called 14 Points of 1918. This is after World War I. Woodrow Wilson was an idealist, you could say. He obviously was against Soviet-style communism, but he argued that, look, you don't have to have a bloody world revolution just to progress the world. Yes, European colonialism was evil, and he called for self-determination for all people in the world. But he said the creation of democracy and the safeguarding of human rights was the way to achieve that. More trade, not less trade, more capitalism would be a way of bringing nations together. And collective security through the League of Nations, which is a forerunner to the United Nations, would be a way to bring harmony globally. So two rival visions of what the world should look like emerged after World War I. So although you may be thinking that, communism or socialism had a very utopian vision, the ideology did evolve in the 1920s and 30s, and to the point where communism became associated with a kind of sinister dictatorship, a sinister authoritarianism. So the reason for that would be the rise to power of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. When Lenin died in the 1920s, there was a power struggle in Soviet Russia. Stalin would emerge as leader in 1929, and he would turn the Soviet Union into what's called a totalitarian dictatorship, where the state would have, where Stalin would have total control over all aspects of life for the people. All remaining democracy kind of disappeared from Soviet communism, and he unleashed internal repression on a vast scale. In the Great Terror, millions of Russians and other ethnicities were rounded up into the Soviet Gulag system. Millions died under Stalin's leadership. And the phrase Stalinism really describes a very authoritarian style of communism, where human life would be considered secondary to economic development. The rapid industrialization of the country and the collectivization of agriculture through human kind of resource. And that just, if you think about those policies, repression, terror, and the kind of disregard for human life, you can see why communism, as developed in the USSR in the mid-war period, you can see why it would stoke fears in the West. So kind of the ideology, as it became more totalitarian, would kind of drive many in the West to kind of fear communism. But also, things developed in the 1930s which drove some of those powers apart. Soviet foreign policy in the 1930s provoked suspicion in the West. It seems like communism wants to destroy us, and if you look at the actions the Soviet Union took, it seemed true. Now, the rise of Hitler in 1933, if you've studied GCSE, you will know he posed a direct threat to both the West and the USSR. Hitler was very anti-communist. But Britain, France, and the Soviet Union couldn't form an alliance because they distrusted each other so much. So unfortunately, Hitler was allowed to expand within Europe. And Stalin looked at the policies of the West, how they seemed to be appeasing Hitler. And Stalin argued, well, it seems like Germany, Britain, France are really ganging up. France and Britain are allowing Hitler to kind of expand. And Stalin feared there was a kind of Western capitalist plot to use Hitler's fascist movement to kind of invade the Soviet Union. So global politics is very confusing at times, and it forced Stalin to kind of sign a pact with Hitler You would have thought they'd be worst enemies, but in 1939, Stalin signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and both powers agreed to divide up Poland between them. The USSR took eastern Poland and Germany took western Poland. And not only that, but the pact allowed Stalin to invade and annex, to take land from Finland, the Baltic states, that's Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And this kind of cemented the view in the West that communism was an aggressive ideology. It was repressive at home and abroad, and that it was expansionist. You can see the appeasement policies there. That's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of the UK and Adolf Hitler, Chancellor. So we've talked so far this lesson about how ideology drove a division between the US and the West on the one side and Soviet communism on the other. Yet during World War II, they became allies, and it's understanding why that happened that we need to kind of cover now. So we said that Germany and the USSR had an alliance, and that enabled Germany to invade Poland. In doing so, that started World War II in Europe, as Britain and France declared war on Germany. Yet in 1941, this changed. Hitler's Germany invaded the USSR, and very quickly, Britain and Russia found themselves with a common enemy. They were now on the same side in a war, and both sides began to cooperate. Now, the USA at this time was officially neutral, but it did start supplying Britain with weapons and supplies, and the USSR. The USA signed something called the Atlantic Charter in 1941 with the UK, which was a statement of kind of principles of what the world should look like after World War II, very similar to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. And the US began to supply both Soviet Russia and the UK with money. $50 billion was sent to both nations with its Lend-Lease policy. So the USA was really helping these allies, Britain and the USSR. But they weren't official allies. The USA wasn't in the war, but that changed with Pearl Harbor. On the 7th of December 1931, Japan attacked the USA. Probably the worst mistake of his career, Adolf Hitler then declares war on the USA a few days later, and Italy as well. So now officially, with that declaration of war, the UK, the USA, and the USSR were now on the same side with common enemies. And you can see in the images here how it's that fear of Hitler and the fear of German fascist domination of Europe that kind of drove these kind of ideological rivals to becoming temporary allies. Okay. And you can see on the map there, Poland being divided up in 1939. And here's an image of the invasion of the USSR by Germany, which was initially successful. And the grey areas show the kind of extent of German occupation of Europe in World War II. Here we see the Atlantic Charter being signed off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941. That's UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And we see the US President here, Roosevelt. So the powers, the US, the UK, the USSR, and along with China, they began to cooperate in the war. Churchill started calling it a Grand Alliance, and the kind of name stuck. This alliance was kind of formalized with a key document, the Declaration by United Nations in January 1942. And the people that signed this document, they all agreed to kind of uphold the principles of the Atlantic Charter, democracy, self-determination, and others, and to fight fascist powers until their surrender. So the Atlantic Charter and the Declaration by United Nations would later become the kind of founding basis of this Grand Alliance, as well as the UN Charter that would be signed after the war. So the principles of capitalist free trade, freedom of religion, economic cooperation, the USSR signed up to that. Stalin agreed to those principles, which seems kind of, does he really believe in them? So, by 1945, despite ideological differences, the world's richest capitalist power, the world's biggest imperialist power, the UK, and the world's strongest communist state were now in this strange alliance. How we get to Cold War is the basis of the next lesson. So, what role did ideology play in the Grand Alliance? Well, it didn't force them together. It was Hitler that forced them together, but it did kind of set some underlying tensions between the allies. And we're going to see how ideology drove kind of them to take different perspectives on issues during World War II and after the war as well. That's it.